Hi, everyone.
Good morning, everybody. Tomorrow is Martin Luther King Jr. Day
It is
on Monday, right? And
a holiday that we celebrate every year.
yeah, and we have some good history about Martin Luther King Jr. and some of his ideas that relate to the Bible story we're working with today. And today we're not really working with the story so much as a teaching. And Jesus had this teaching that in one of the Gospels, he does it on the plain. He's on a flat area in Luke. And then in Matthew, he's on the mountain. But it's a similar lesson in both places. And he's talking about blessings. And these are called the Beatitudes. It's an old word that comes out of beauty and means blessing. And it is an amazing teaching because it's saying that we should do things very differently than we often do.
But this week we are focusing on just one of the Beatitudes about peacemakers.
Yes. And we did that partly because Martin Luther King Jr. was a peacemaker.
It was.
And when we think about peacemakers, we might think someone who's always trying to be nice and gentle, right? Or solve problems.
But they can't always be nice and gentle.
No. And what's amazing about this is almost always when you think about a peacemaker in the Bible, they are making peace towards truth and towards fairness. And it is not just making peace for the sake of quiet.
Right.
Or solving a problem very quickly. It's sort of a long, steady holding to truth and to rightness or justice.
But not through violence.
And not through violence. And so Jesus does this his whole life, and he doesn't ever lift a sword. One of his disciples once tried to protect him and lifted a sword, and Jesus said, don't do that. And you may know more about that story later. But for now, we're thinking a lot about all the people that have learned from Jesus that peacemaking is not a simple task, but it is a vital, important task in all of our lives. And it's far easier, I think, to fight than to make peace. You have to be more courageous to be a peacemaker sometimes. So we will start with Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who was a pastor in Alabama, and he grew up in Atlanta, and his father was a pastor at Ebenezer Baptist Church. And you can go there. It's a national park now, and visit and learn all about his life growing up. But Dr. King had this amazing link with other people who also did this peacemaking work, and they called it something a little different. They called it civil disobedience. So we're going a little further into peacemaking here. They're talking about making some trouble to get to the right place, but doing it without violence. And so
good trouble.
And that's what John Lewis called it.
Good trouble.
Good trouble. And John Lewis is someone you may have heard about. You can ask your parents about him. But Dr. King actually studied a man named Mahatma Gandhi, and he went to visit him in 1959 in India. And Gandhi was known for this idea of civil disobedience or nonviolent resistance, where he wanted the English to leave India. They had come in and conquered India and had made it one of their colonies, and it was time for them to go. And so he led marches that were peaceful. And sometimes they were beaten or hit, but they would stay peaceful.
And he would even go on, he would fast and not eat for weeks.
Yep, in order to make the point that this was not fair to the people of India, and it was time for the British to leave. And then we could go further back. Gandhi had studied an American who had studied old Indian writings, and his name was Henry David Thoreau. And a lot of people don't know about Thoreau, but Thoreau was a writer, and he is best known for living in a small cabin by Concord Pond, Walden Pond in Concord, Massachusetts. And what he did, he objected to the Mexican War and felt like it was not a fair war. So he chose to not pay his taxes. And then they put him in jail. So his civil disobedience was to not pay his taxes. And he went to jail. And then while he was there, he wrote Civil Disobedience. And so Gandhi read Thoreau, and then King read Gandhi. So it's pretty amazing. And we may have a map to show you, or if not, you can look these up. But there are other people who did this in history that aren't as well known as these three men. And I think we should just mention them too. And there are a lot of them, but here are two more. Let's see. We have Harriet Tubman. And you may
Which
have learned
I think a
about
lot
her.
of you have probably heard of Harriet Tubman. There was a movie that came out in the last couple of years about Harriet Tubman. And she was known to, she would help free slaves.
Yeah.
And she was known to a lot of them as Moses because she was always let my people go.
Yeah, she was a liberator.
She was.
Made freedom. So she did a thing called the Underground Railroad, and you've probably heard about it. But if you haven't, it's a great thing to learn about.
I think you can go to it in Atlanta, can't you?
You can there. And in Savannah, there are churches where slaves would hide under the floor of the church and then they would sneak out at night and they would travel. And then they would go to the next safe spot. And I lived near one in Wilmington, Delaware, where they came right up through the rivers around Wilmington and all the way up into Brooklyn. And I was at a church in Brooklyn, and they had a place to hide slaves under the floor also. And Harriet Tubman was one of the major organizers of all of that railroad, along with a lot of other people who believed when things are wrong, you've got to work to make them right, but do it peacefully. And then we have another woman, and her name is Sojourner Truth. And she was an incredibly gifted woman who was born as a slave, and she worked for women's rights and the rights of Black people. And she is an amazing speaker. If you have a chance to look at some of her speeches, she's yet another one. And so there's so many of these people who worked for peace and for truth and the rightness and fairness that we call justice. And this is a big part of our church tradition that we want to embrace and have you think about. And if you have a chance to do some research and look this up.
Maybe there's a peacemaker that you can find from history that you didn't know about and research it. Maybe who's somebody that you know, maybe in your family, in your church, in the community, who's a peacemaker.
And then the day-to-day part of this might be when people argue, and we do argue, right? And they get hurt or upset, they might cry. It is for us as Christians to try to come to terms with what happened. Maybe we can help, and let's make this come back to normal where we can be peaceful and share with one another and do our best to make things fair.
We can all be peacemakers.
We can. And so with Jesus' teaching, all these blessings just are great challenges for us to live a blessed life. And to live a blessed life has a lot of beautiful things in it, and peacemaking is one of them. So we hope on Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and partly during this time of COVID, you can have some time to look some of these people up and find some more peacemakers.
Yes, there are a lot out there. There may be people that you know in your community.
Yeah. And so one of the things we often say it in church or in our gatherings at camp or with our family, we say, may the peace of Christ be with you.
And also with you.
And that's the response. So let's say that again. May the peace of Christ be with you.
And also with you.